In 2005, Steve Jobs offered Intel the iPhone, and Intel said no. Over a few dollars a chip. The CEO who turned it down later admitted the volume was 100 times what anyone thought. This was the company that invented the microprocessor. The company inside almost every computer on Earth. And it passed on the most profitable product in human history, because a spreadsheet said the margins were too thin. That was the beginning. What came after was worse. Intel missed the phone entirely. Then it broke its own factories. Then it lost the manufacturing lead it had held since 1971. Then Apple fired it. Then a company it had laughed at for 20 years, a company that made graphics cards for video games, became worth more than Intel ever was. And then something happened that nobody predicted. In August of 2025, the United States government bought 10% of Intel. Not a loan. Not a grant. Shares. The federal government became the largest shareholder of the company that built Silicon Valley. A few weeks later, Nvidia, the company that took everything from Intel, put $5 billion in and became the second largest. Intel stock had its best day in almost 38 years. So which story is this? The fall of an empire, or the strangest comeback in corporate history? Stay with me, because the answer depends on a conversation that happened in 1985, between two men in a room in Santa Clara, and a question that saved this company once already. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Intel lost the future, and why the man running it today keeps using one very specific word. To understand how far Intel fell, you have to understand how high it stood. 1968. Two men walk out of Fairchild Semiconductor to start something of their own. One is Robert Noyce, the co-inventor of the integrated circuit, the thing that makes all modern electronics possible. The other is Gordon Moore, who 4 years earlier had written down an observation that would become the metronome of the entire technology industry: the number of transistors on a chip would double roughly every 2 years. They called it Moore's Law. It wasn't a law of physics. It was a promise. And for 50 years, Intel was the company that kept it. They hired a Hungarian refugee named Andrew Grove as employee number 3. Noyce was the visionary. Moore was the scientist. Grove was the one who made the trains run on time, and he would become the most important of the three. In 1971, Intel shipped the 4004. The world's first commercial microprocessor. An entire computer's brain on a single piece of silicon the size of a fingernail. Before this, computers filled rooms. After this, they fit in your pocket. Intel didn't just enter the computer industry. Intel created it. Then came the deal that made them untouchable. 1981, IBM chose Intel's chip for its personal computer. IBM was the biggest technology company on Earth, and its PC became the template that everyone copied. Every clone needed an Intel-compatible processor. The architecture had a name, x86, and it became the standard for the entire planet. Pair that with Microsoft's operating system and you get Wintel, two companies that quietly taxed almost every computer sold, for 2 decades. And then, in 1991, Intel did something almost nobody in the components business had ever pulled off. It made an invisible part famous. Intel Inside. A sticker. A 5-note jingle. Suddenly ordinary people who could not tell you what a transistor was were walking into stores asking whether the computer had Intel in it. A component became a consumer brand. By the end of the 90s, Intel wasn't competing. Intel was the ground everyone else stood on. But here's the part almost everyone forgets. Intel almost died first. And how it survived is the key to everything that came later. Rewind to the early 80s. Intel was not a processor company. Intel was a memory company. Memory chips, DRAM, were its identity, its origin, the largest share of its revenue. And it was losing badly. Japanese manufacturers were making memory faster, cheaper, and better. Prices collapsed. Intel was bleeding, and every executive in the building had a reason why they should keep fighting. Memory was who they were. You don't walk away from who you are. Then came the conversation. Grove sat across from Gordon Moore in his office, and he asked a question that is now taught in every business school on earth. He asked, if we got kicked out and the board brought in a new chief executive, what do you think he would do? Moore answered without hesitating. He said, he would get us out of memory. And Grove looked at him and said, why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back in, and do it ourselves? Think about what that actually required. They shut down plants. They laid off roughly a third of the company. They walked away from the business that made them, on nothing but the cold logic that a stranger would have done it in an afternoon. It was brutal. It was correct. Intel was out of memory by 1986 and back in profit by 1987, pointed at the microprocessor, the thing that would make it one of the most valuable companies on the planet. Grove wrote a book about how he thought. He called it, Only the Paranoid Survive. His argument was simple and uncomfortable. Success is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a company, because success makes you certain, and certainty makes you slow, and the world does not stop moving while you admire your own market share. Remember that sentence. Because Intel spent the next 20 years proving him right, by forgetting it. 2005. Apple is not the Apple you know today. It has no phone. It is a computer company with a music player, and it has just done something enormous for Intel. It has agreed to put Intel chips inside every Macintosh. And then Steve Jobs comes back with a second question. He is building something new. Something small. He wants to know if Intel will make the chip for it. Paul Otellini is Intel's chief executive. He is not a fool. He is a career Intel man, disciplined, data-driven, exactly the kind of operator the company had spent decades rewarding. He looks at the deal. Apple wants a specific price. Not a nickel more. And that price sits below what Intel forecasts the chip will cost to build. So Otellini says no. Listen to how he described it years later, on his way out the door. His words, we ended up not winning it, or passing on it, depending on how you want to view it. And the world would have been a lot different if we'd done it. Then the part that should make you wince. He said, at the end of the day, there was a chip that they were interested in that they wanted to pay a certain price for and not a nickel more, and that price was below our forecasted cost. I couldn't see it. It wasn't one of these things you can make up on volume. And then, in hindsight, the forecasted cost was wrong, and the volume was 100 times what anyone thought. 100 times. The device was the iPhone. Intel had it. Intel measured it. And Intel's own numbers told it to walk away. And here is where the whole story folds in on itself. Otellini's last word on it was this: so many times in my career I've ended up making decisions with my gut, and I should have followed my gut. Do you see it? 1985, Grove ignores the emotional argument and follows the cold logic, and saves the company. 2005, Otellini ignores his gut and follows the cold logic, and loses the future. Same company. Same discipline. Opposite result. Because the thing Grove was actually protecting wasn't logic. It was paranoia. And a monopoly cannot be paranoid. It has nothing left to be afraid of. The iPhone shipped in 2007. It ran on an ARM processor, a rival architecture, designed for low power, the exact thing Intel had decided was not worth the margin. And then every phone on Earth followed. Billions of them. An entire computing platform, larger than the PC ever was, built on chips that were not Intel's. Intel tried to force its way in with a line called Atom, spent years and billions, and by 2016 it gave up and cancelled the effort. The phone was gone. Permanently. But losing mobile is not what broke Intel. Intel could survive missing a market. What Intel could not survive was breaking the one thing that made it Intel, the factories. Here's what you need to understand. Almost every chip company on Earth designs chips and pays someone else to build them. Intel did both. It designed and it manufactured, and its manufacturing was the best in the world, by a wide margin, for 40 years. That was the moat. Anyone could copy an Intel design. Nobody could copy an Intel fab. Then came 10 nanometer. Each new generation of chips shrinks the transistors. Intel had done this over and over, like clockwork. 10 nanometer was supposed to arrive in 2016. It slipped to 2017. Then 2018. Then, in April of 2018, Chief Executive Brian Krzanich stood up and pushed it again, to 2019. Read that again. Roughly 5 years between generations, for a company whose entire identity was a law that said to. Krzanich's own explanation was almost painfully honest. He said Intel had bit off a little too much. It had tried to increase density by 2.7 times over its previous generation. The industry norm is about 1.5 to 2. Intel didn't just aim high. It aimed at something it could not build. And underneath that was a deeper mistake, the kind you only see afterward. Intel had underinvested in the next generation of lithography machines, the extreme ultraviolet systems made by a Dutch company called ASML. Intel thought it could get there without them. It could not. The company that wrote Moore's Law had just broken it. In public. For years. While Intel was stuck, the world moved. In Taiwan, a company called TSMC had spent 30 years doing the unglamorous thing, building other people's chips. No brand. No sticker. No jingle. Just factories. And in the second half of 2018, exactly while Intel was announcing another delay, TSMC ramped 7 nanometer into volume production. That was the moment. Not a headline, not a scandal. A quiet Taiwanese manufacturer simply walked past the company that had defined manufacturing since the moon landing. Intel had lost the lead it had held for its entire existence. And once you lose that, you cannot buy it back. You have to earn it, one generation at a time, while your competitor keeps running. Now watch what that unlocked. AMD had been Intel's punchline for decades, the budget option, the thing you bought when you couldn't afford real. AMD did something Intel structurally could not, it gave up its own factories, and hired TSMC. Suddenly the underdog was building on better silicon than the giant. AMD's Zen chips arrived and they were not merely competitive. They were better. Market share started moving, 10%, 12%, and it kept climbing. Intel's response was to keep selling the same generation with more plus signs after its name. And then came the amputation. In 2020, Apple announced it was leaving. After 15 years, it would design its own processors for the Mac. The M1 arrived and it was not a compromise, it was faster and cooler and lasted longer than the Intel machines it replaced, and everyone could see it. Sit with the symmetry for a second. 2005, Intel tells Apple no, because the numbers say the margin is too thin. 2020, Apple tells Intel no, because Intel can't build a competitive chip. 15 years, exactly, from rejection to revenge. In 2021, Intel brought back a believer. Pat Gelsinger had been Intel's chief technology officer, an Andy Grove protege, a man who had left and now returned to save the place. His plan was enormous: rebuild the factories, catch up on process, and open Intel's fabs to outside customers, become a foundry, like TSMC. It was the right plan. It was also the most expensive thing the company had ever attempted. Rebuilding a semiconductor company takes about 5 years and tens of billions of dollars. Wall Street gives you about 5 quarters. By 2024, the math had turned on Gelsinger. The factories were being built, but the money was pouring out and the products weren't landing. Intel had missed the biggest technology wave since the internet, artificial intelligence, and the chips everyone suddenly wanted were not Intel's. They were Nvidia's. Think about that pairing for a moment. Nvidia had spent decades making graphics cards for video games, a business Intel never took seriously enough to fight for. And it turned out that the same math that draws imaginary explosions on a screen is the math that trains artificial intelligence. Nvidia didn't beat Intel at Intel's game. Nvidia was playing a different game, and the world walked over to its table. Then came the year Intel would like to forget. Intel suspended its dividend, a signal that a company like this almost never sends, because it tells every long-term shareholder the cash is not there. It announced mass layoffs, thousands and thousands of people. The stock cratered. And the paranoia Andy Grove had built into the walls was long gone, replaced with committees and denial. On the 2nd of December, 2024, the board ousted Pat Gelsinger. Read the reasoning carefully, because it is the whole tragedy in a sentence: an extended slump, market share losses in its core business, and an inability to crack artificial intelligence. The man who came back to fix a 20-year decline was fired for not fixing it in 3. And this is the moment when a normal story ends. The empire falls. The rival wins. Somebody makes a documentary about it, 5 years pass, and the company becomes a case study in a business school slide about arrogance. But that's not what happened. Because what happened next was genuinely stranger than the fall. In March of 2025, Intel hired a new chief executive, Lip-Bu Tan. Not a showman. A veteran with deep connections across the industry, a reputation for cutting costs without ceremony, and a very sober way of speaking about a company that had been promising miracles for a decade. And then the American government did something it does not do. On the 22nd, the price tag, $8.9 billion. 433 million shares at $20.47 each. Roughly 10% of the company. The money didn't even come from a new program, most of it was CHIPS Act funding that had already been awarded and simply hadn't been paid, converted into equity. The country that spent 80 years telling the world that governments should not own companies just became the largest shareholder in the company that invented the microprocessor. That is how strategically important these factories were judged to be. Then September. Nvidia invested $5 billion for about 5%, and became the second largest shareholder. The company that had won by making Intel irrelevant now had a direct financial interest in Intel surviving. The stock jumped 22% in a single day, Intel's best day in almost 38 years. SoftBank added $2 billion more. And here's the twist you didn't see coming. At the start of 2026, Intel launched Panther Lake, the first chips on its 18A process, the most advanced silicon it has ever built, and confirmed a foundry deal with Apple. Read that again. Apple. The company Intel refused in 2005 and that fired Intel in 2020 is now paying Intel to build its silicon in America. Analysts leaked that 18A yields had stabilized above 60%. Intel beat Wall Street 6 quarters in a row. The stock rose 84% in 1 year and kept going. That government stake, bought for under $9 billion, is now worth around $36 billion. Taxpayers, accidentally, are up. So, happy ending? Not so fast. In July of 2026, reports landed that 18A might not reach truly profitable yields until 2027. AMD passed Intel in data center revenue. The stock fell 7% in a day and 21% in a week. The comeback is real. It is not finished. Which brings us back to that room in Santa Clara. Asked about the turnaround this year, Lip-Bu Tan said Intel is embracing its paranoid roots. That word is not an accident. That word is Andy Grove's word. It's the title of his book, and it's the thing Intel forgot the moment it became untouchable, the moment it looked at the iPhone and saw a bad margin instead of a threat. Because here's what Grove actually understood. Paranoia isn't fear. Paranoia is the discipline of a company that refuses to believe it has already won. Intel didn't lose to Apple, or to TSMC, or to Nvidia. Intel lost to certainty. And it will only stay back if it stays afraid. So tell me what you think in the comments. Did the United States save Intel, or just nationalize the consequences of 20 years of bad decisions? I genuinely want to know where you land on that one. If you made it this far, subscribe. Every empire on this channel starts the same way, with people who are certain, and ends the same way too. See you in the next one.